Now, following World War II, again, there were also nations that are born under British and French mandates. So, for example, we have Israel in 47. We have Pakistan in 47. We have Lebanon as well. So the British and French, after carving up the Middle East, they granted certain nations to be created. One of them being Israel. The British, the Balfour Declaration, we know what happened there. But also Pakistan. Lord Minto, and also at the end it was Mountbatten, that's it, thank you very much, Mountbatten. And Lebanon, the French give Lebanon, right? So these were outposts, effectively. They were given these projects, and these were new nations created. One for the Jewish Zionist, Israel. One for the Islamic Republic, Pakistan. And one for the Christian Maronites, Lebanon. So this is a lesson that we all have to learn, whether we like it or not. Whether we like it or not. The colonial administration, as they left the Middle East and Asia, they left 3 children behind. Israel, Pakistan, Lebanon. 1 Jewish, 1 Muslim, 1 Christian. It's not something that we want to hear as Muslims, but the reality is, in the same way Israel was created, Pakistan was created the same way. And Lebanon was created the same way. Jewish, Muslim, Christian nations, all 3 created with the endorsement and support of the British and French, and created for a specific religious community to rule it, at least, because in Lebanon you have a mix, but the rule is only for the Christian Maronites. So that's the reality of that. That's the reality of that. So they leave confusion behind as they leave. Now we have a second group of nations that are born out of that as well, who are still under British protectorate and French protectorate. So you have Egypt, Jordan, Iraq, Syria, and the Persian Gulf, Qatar, Kuwait, and Bahrain. These are the nations, newly founded nations, but still under the British for a while. And finally, you have 2 nations amongst the Muslim nations that are self-independently created. It's a bit difficult to explain, but Turkey is clear. Ataturk stood up and defended his realms, and so established his own republic. In Saudi Arabia, you have the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, Abdul Aziz. Again, this will be disputed whether he did it independently or not independently, but he seized the territory and it became Saudi Arabia. So these are the 3 categories of nations in the Muslim world, the most influential nations, how they were created after World War II. The first category are those who were signed, and it was a collaboration and an agreement with the colonial masters to create a nation for Christians, Jews, or Muslims. That's Palestine, that's Israel, Pakistan, Lebanon. The second group are those who became independent on paper, but were still under the British yoke and protectorate for a while. And the third category are those who took it for themselves. Okay? Those who took the nation for themselves and then were recognized as a result of that by Britain and France. So the world at that time entered a new phase. There were those who can fend for themselves, and there were those who needed supporters to survive in a new world. The Ottoman Empire, as much as some of our brothers and sisters would like to say they were useless and effectively usurpers and even illegitimate, they still serve this tremendous purpose in the Muslim world. They still serve the tremendous purpose in the Muslim world. And when that was removed from the Muslim Ummah, we had new problems. To this very day, we haven't resolved the problems. To this very day, we have not resolved the problems. So the Ottoman Empire, having been ripped out of the heart of the Ummah, left behind it a problem that could not be resolved with anything that came after that. And we're going to see, in fact, in the next this session, next session, just how true this is. So that's the background of where we're going to head into in the following decades. So here we can see the Ottoman Empire at its greatest expanse. It had regions and territories in Europe, in Central Asia, in the Arabian Peninsula, in North Africa, in East Africa. But by 1918, everything was reduced just to Turkey, Istanbul. Okay, everything was taken by the other empires and just left with Turkey, which was then turned into a republic in 1923. So Ataturk was able to maintain Turkey as an independent state. All the other regions of the empire had gone. So for example, in the Balkans, you have the Balkanization. They become independent nations. You have the Arab nations also become independent nations, or at least go under the British and French. The only thing left is Turkey. All right, so there's a dismissal of everything that used to be the Ottoman Empire, and we're left with just a Republic of Turkey. So we've now entered a new world, everyone for themselves. The Muslim body has been broken, and the new nations, some are celebrating. We've finally become independent from the Ottoman Turks. We no longer have to obey these oppressors. But they don't realize that in the years to come, in the decades to come, they have to replace that oppressor with another oppressor. There's no way you can survive without a protector. Let me give you an example, an analogy. It's as if you were working in a certain corrupt district. You have a business front, and you know this district is corrupt. There are corrupt officials around, there are gangsters around, there are criminals in and out every single day. And each one requests some sort of protection money. Now, you have one person who's protecting you for a certain fee. He's not perfect. He may not necessarily be a cup of tea, but he does the job. And by being under his protection, the other wolves and gangsters will not approach you. They know that if we approach this person, this business, he's got protection money. He's got protection from that person. If you focus too much on the repression of that one authority and eventually find a way to remove yourself with no alternative protection, you become prey to every other extortionist and every other gang. And that's what happened to the Muslim Ummah. They got rid of the Ottoman Empire, which according to some, and there is truth in it, there was oppression. There was mass oppression. But when we removed that shield of cover, we opened ourselves up for all the other gangsters in the neighborhood. And believe me, they came. So now we have Muslim nations in 2024 who are paying protection money. Who are paying protection money to non-Muslim nations. And are happy about that. But we're not happy to be under a Muslim empire who was doing the job regardless. Yeah? We have to look back into history. Yeah? It doesn't make any sense. We've gone backwards. And the debates we have in 2024 is it okay to have a non-Muslim nation in our country? That's a debate we have. As oppressive as the Ottoman Empire was, we never had to have that debate. We never had to have that debate. Do we have the Ottomans in the Hijaz or not? That was never a debate and never a talking point. But in 2024, once we got rid of them, that's a talking point. Was it allowed or not allowed? And we're going to get into that discussion, that fatwa, in the next session, inshallah. When Saddam threatens to invade Saudi Arabia. So we need to tie the loose ends now. The Ottoman Empire, as far as I'm concerned, was a good force, a force for good in the Ummah. As far as I'm concerned, with all the problems they had, there was still a force for good. So there was independence across the realms. Some of the nations, the Arab nations, for example, came together, as we've seen, the 𝗼𝗢𝗜 Party, the Arab League, the Muslim World League, various different organizations were being created, the United Arab Republic, to consolidate the Arab bloc, but not to invite the Turks for what? It doesn't make any sense. Yeah? You just got rid of what you wanted to get rid of. No point in calling them back. So it was isolationist in that sense, and there was no central government. There were attempts made by the Arab Muslim nations and the Arab nations, but each one of them failed. Okay? Each one of them failed. Nothing brought the Arabs together in the history of mankind more and better than Islam. No ideology, no movement, nothing in the history of mankind united the Arab world in the way Islam did. Nothing. Go back as far as you like. Nothing brought them together besides Islam. The Arabs, at least, we can talk of. Maybe the Persians, they have other things, maybe the other nations, but the Arabs, nothing brought them together besides Islam. You have nothing prior to Islam that unifies the Arabs that way. There were great nations before, certainly. In Himyar, many great Nabateans, great nations, great civilizations amongst the Arabs, certainly. But they were not unified in the way the Prophet ﷺ, when he passed away, the Hijaz was unified. And beyond his life, the entire Arabian Peninsula was unified. And then beyond that, nothing achieved that. And so the Ba'athi movement, the nationalist movement, the Arab awakening, all of these things were pathetic failures. They could not get the formula right. They didn't last more than 20 years. Right? Each one died within 10, 20 years. So nothing has been working. Since 24 to 2024, nothing has been working. The latest fad is bricks. Bricks. We're going to get to that later, inshallah. Nothing will work. I think Ibn Abbas said, radiallahu anhu, nothing will fix the affairs of the later generations other than what fixed that which came before them. The only way forward is backwards. In other words, the only way to, at least as Muslims, especially the Arabs, the only way to develop and to unify is upon what made you great in the first place. La ilaha illallah Muhammadur Rasulullah. Nothing else will work. Nothing else will work. So we now have a world in which all the great empires have been completely removed. We have got the remaining nations who used to be colonies now are fighting for independence. It's a huge wave across the world, independence movements after World War II. The French and the British, especially, and the Italians, begin to give independence. Whether willfully or unwillingly, they have to give independence. And so there's now a huge population of nations who are newly independent. The Americans are moving around trying to find as many allies as possible across the world. But at the same time, past 45, so after World War II, 1945, America is a superpower, but the Soviet bloc is also a superpower. So the Russians come back, and they are a counterweight to the American superpower. So both of these are new superpowers. And they're fighting another war. It's not World War III, it's called the Cold War. Not World War III, it should be called World War III to be honest, but it's called the Cold War. Because in the next 40 to 45 years, these two empires are going to go around the world recruiting allies, fighting wars, proxy wars, and trying to beat the other in any possible way. Technologically, socially, intellectually, economically, they are completely at war on all fronts for the next 40, 45 years. And in the process of doing that, many nations fall foul of their influence. So America named itself, or came to be known as the free world. The free world, also known as the West, also known as democratic, liberal democracies, also known as the first world. So many AKAs. They stood for capitalism, liberal democracy, patriotism. They stood for these kind of principles here. And today you can add human rights, right? They champion human rights, quote unquote human rights. And in 1945, straight after World War II is over, if you remember we discussed this, they established the World Bank, the IMF, and NATO, okay, North Atlantic Treaty Organization, in 1945. And this was to ensure that there would never be another global war, and that if one member of NATO is attacked, the others would come and support them. So they established a global network of nations that would help one another and to avoid another conflict at a global scale, 1945. And to help rebuild the nations that suffered during the wars, the IMF and the World Bank were established. But in reality, these were just other means of enslaving these nations with debts, effectively, monetarily. So the United States marks itself as the only effective superpower at that time. But then the Russians say, no, wait a second. We also have something going on in the East. The Soviet Union is born, or the Soviet communists, or the Russian Bear, or the East, the Eastern Bloc. Many names are given to them. And in 1955, 10 years after NATO, they created their own organization, the Warsaw Pact. So they came together with several nations and did the same thing that America did in 45. They did the same thing 10 years later in 55. So now you have two world organizations, one in the West and one in the East. NATO, Warsaw Pact, where the free world championed capitalism and private ownership and democracy. The East and the Soviets championed communism, egalitarianism, and anti-imperialism. Fascinating stuff. Fascinating stuff. So the communists were saying, we stand for the opposite of what the Western democracies stand for. We don't believe in private ownership because the owning class, the bourgeoisie, those who own the means of production, oppress those who work, the working class. In our societies, we have egalitarianism. We are all equal. And we commonly own the means of production. So the factories, the production plants is owned by the community. And we all share in the products. So there's no, you could say, social disparity. And we are anti-imperial. We are anti-colonization, anti-imperial kingdoms and the upper strata. We don't have any of these systems in our ideology. It's about equality across the world. So now the Muslim world is stuck between these two giants. I want you to imagine you have just become an independent country. You're trying to develop your nation independently for the first time in a long time. And you're looking for ways by which to ensure that your economy is in a good position, your military is up to scratch, and you're not going to risk being invaded by one of the neighboring nations who may have ambitions of itself growing beyond its borders. Out there in the world, there are two organizations. There's the UN and there's the Warsaw Pact. And you have to pick one of these two. Well, you don't have to pick, you can remain independent, but that's very dangerous, especially if the neighbors are picking sides already. Your neighbors are picking sides. You need to pick a side to remain safe. On the one side, you have the Americans telling you, hey, we believe in capitalism. That means, you can be as rich as you like to be. You can be as prosperous as you want to be. Private ownership is a thing here. We will not oppress you. Right? We believe in democracy. Let people choose for themselves how to be ruled. Freedom, right? And human rights. And also, we are the greatest nation. We're the freest nation. We are the first world. Join our club. Then you have the Soviets saying, no, these are the same nations who colonized you in the first place. They are the same nations who you've just recently become independent from. Come to us. We're the guys who left the war 1 year early. We're the guys who removed the Russian Tsar. We're the guys who talk about equality. There's no segregation of social tiers. If you join our bloc, you'll have an equal society. The society will be a fair society. A socialist society, equality, but more importantly, anti-imperialist. We will not support the colonizers and those who have made a history for themselves colonizing nations. So the Russians were more of a revolutionary force, a new force, right? So the Muslim world effectively was divided between these two camps, and we're going to see how each nation, or most nations, sided with one or the other. Okay. It's very difficult for us in 2024 to understand the zeitgeist of the time, the spirit of the age. Right? Why would any Muslim nation want to side with the Russians, who were atheists, did not believe in God whatsoever? Why would they want to side with the Americans and Brits, who are just colonized, they've just become free from them? Why go back to them? Why not just become independent as Muslims and create a central Islamic organization and everything is fine? Why not just work that way and have another khilaf or something independent of these two nations and remain neutral to all of that? These are good questions. So the term superpower is quite is a recently new term, because in the history of mankind we have had nations, empires, mega empires, but superpowers, it's a new concept, right? The first time we've heard this term being even slightly mentioned was by George Orwell in 1945, when he's looking at the current events at that time, after World War II, and he begins to see how the Americans and the Russians are growing in popularity and in influence. And he talks of, in a time not so long from now, you may have 2 or 3 super states, each one of them trying to grow bigger and better, and finding better ways to kill the other. So effectively an arms race. It says over time, they will both become so great that they can mutually annihilate one another. Okay? And at this point, they become super states, or superpowers. So he coined the term in 45. It didn't take very long, actually, about 3 years. And we began to see the reality of this prediction. Yeah? So it's quite an interesting point, because if you think about it, there's only so much territory one power can have. Right? There's only so much influence you can have before you begin to butt heads with the other power, Russia and America. The world is not big enough for both powers. And so there is going to be at some point, effectively, a competition, a showdown between the two nations or the two superpowers. And what that means for the rest of the world is what concerns all of us. You know, how will that effectively come to an end, if at all? So the Cold War effectively is called the Cold War because it was a war in effect, not a direct conflict between America and the Russians. They never went to war directly because they couldn't. They were just too big to do that. You know, they were just too big to do that. It would be mutual annihilation. So rather than going to war directly, what they did was they did proxy wars. They did wars of attrition. They went through other nations. They were fighting wars in other ways. One of the ways in which they were fighting wars or competing was with technology. The arms race and the space race. Developing the technology at a rapid pace to outdo the other, right? So who can get to the moon first? Who can develop a nuclear weapon first? They began to race to become bigger and better. So the nuclear race and the space race began. We had on one side the Russians, the Soviets, and on the other side, the Americans, or the free world. And each one was saying, if the other one gets the weapon before us, the entire world is in danger. So we have to be quicker and better to prevent them from annihilating the rest of the world. So that was the ideological back and forth between the two nations. In 1949, the Soviets, they developed their first atomic warhead. So prior to that, America had some, but nobody else had some. But in 1949, the playing field is settled. And now the Soviets have their own warheads. And they begin to demonstrate and test to show that we have the capacity. So that really means, listen, you've got a gun, I've got a gun as well. Let's find a way to be more diplomatic, because both of us will have to die. If we eventually take the guns out, we both have to die. So they find other ways. In 1949, the Chinese government is taken over by the communists, which means now Russia has a major ally in the region, but a really significant, sizable influence in China. So now America has to counterbalance that effect in the East with other nations, in South America, for example, in the Middle East, because China is a massive stakeholder. And if they become communist, which they have in 1949, Russia has just become basically two superpowers in one. Okay? So America and the Western world is now afraid for what's going to happen if these nations in the East begin to advance west, begin to encroach in the Western side of things. Okay? So NATO was formed in 1945, as I mentioned, after the war. In 1955, 10 years later, the Soviets respond with their own pacts, the Warsaw Pact. And so now the world is really divided into two camps. Really divided into two camps. They begin to race. Who can get to the moon first? Who can develop the most powerful technology to get to the moon and to set satellites and to develop technology, aerodynamic technology. And we're going to see actually now what I've done. I've put a video together that will show you from the actually in real time when it was happening, how both nations were racing with one another, or both blocks were racing with one another in all fields. And at the same time, they were producing powerful propaganda against the other. So it wasn't strange in the 1940s and 50s, especially in American media, to find films, to see adverts, to see posters warning you about the communists, the Red Peril, right? And creating an atmosphere of fear and suspicion amongst the Americans, to be wary of communists, or commies as they used to call them. Okay? All of this was part of the conflict and the ongoing competition to win the hearts and minds of people. Okay, so there was a lot of propaganda, a lot of spying, double agents, and proxy wars. So this is where the civil rights movements and the anti-war protests in the 60s would also come into it. They would be accused of being communists. Okay, so the propaganda now was spread. Anyone who was against the American establishment could easily be dismissed as a communist, and that would have severe consequences. Yeah, so the people at the time were actually prepared and psychologically conditioned to see anyone who was against America in any possible way as a communist. Yeah, so that was the effect of the propaganda. And again, it goes both ways, because likewise, if you were in Russia, you would also have the same thing being shoved down your throat. Okay? So this is where we are with the propaganda. Today you can remove the communist and replace it with Islamist. Okay, remove communist and replace it with Islamist. So that was the Cold War in effect. They were on all fronts: economic policy, one was communist, one was capitalist, space wars, space competition, technological advance, societal reforms. Everything was a competition for these two major blocks in the world. And of course, as I said before, when they go into war, everybody else has to be involved. It's never just the Europeans. Everybody else is sucked into their war, unfortunately. So the Cold War, by 1948, only 3 years. Keep this in mind. World War I is over in 1918. In 1939, another war begins. In 1945, that war comes to an end. America arises as a new superpower. 3 years later, we haven't even had time to take a break. We have another conflict developing between the West now, the Western Hemisphere, and the East, between the Western democracies and the Soviet Union in the East. And so from 1948 to 1991, we have another conflict of global proportions. So really the world hasn't had a break since 1914. Literally almost 100 years, right? No break. Global conflict. And all of it driven by the West. All of it driven by Western nations. So by 1948, 3 years into the peace era, Soviets began to go around Eastern Europe, which was closer to where they were, subverting governments and also instigating revolutions so that they can put in place communist governments. So they began doing that. They also had the Red Army. This was the military backing. They would go into nations with their heavy tanks and effectively take over the territory. So this was coming from the East. And the Western Hemisphere, you can look at the map below here. We're gonna analyze it a bit more in the next slide. Most of their territory was in North America, much of South America. You have the Middle East, certain regions there. Europe, of course, continental Europe, and Eurasia. Right? So you have most of these are under NATO. And the Russians or the Soviet, mostly China and Russia, and Eastern Europe, including Western Germany, up until Western Germany. You have southern Yemen, and you have Syria, some parts in the Levant, Sham. Syria, Iraq at some point also was there. And parts of Iran. I mean, under Mossadegh, you could say Iran was under the Soviets, and then it flipped back to the Americans when the Shah came back. And also the eastern Horn of Africa. We're going to talk about that specifically. Right? There are some regions in West Africa, but the eastern Horn of Africa was most severely affected by communist ideology. Eritrea, Ethiopia, Eritrea, Ethiopia, Somalia, more specifically affected there. Yeah. So each of these two blocks was working to increase their market share effectively. How do we export this ideology to more nations? The Russians or the Soviets managed to get to South America, Nicaragua, and also specifically Cuba, which really alerted the American authorities, because within their own territory, within 100 miles to the American shores, you had a hostile communist nation, Cuba, and that became a major problem. You also had some of the Caribbean, Grenada as well. So America dealt with those nations very quickly, but couldn't take Cuba down. Okay, so there were many issues, but the final battleground would be in Central Asia. The final battleground between these two major empires would be right in the middle, and we're going to get into that inshallah. So they began to do this. So they were fighting proxy wars, destabilizing nations, propping up their own puppet governments. Each one was doing that from both sides. And they began to get closer to one another. Okay, they began to get closer to one another, and the closer they became to one another, the more dangerous the conflict became, and the more casualties would be in between the two warring factions. So let's look at the map now. This is circa 1948 to about 1991, because 1948 is officially, I mean, you could say it begins in 1945. But 48 is official. There are only two major superpowers in the world, the Eastern Bloc and the Western Bloc, Russia and America. This was really the height of it all. And 1991 was the end of it, okay? You could say 1989, that's when they left Afghanistan, but 1991 officially came to an end. So at the height of it all, this is what the world looked like when it came to the ideologies. I want you to think of your nation, identify your nation, whether ancestral nation or where you live right now, and identify. If it's red, it's going to be in the Soviet world. If it's blue, it's going to be in the Western democratic world, the first world. Most of these nations are Muslim nations around here. Most are Muslim nations. And those that are not directly under the Americans actually are under protection of the Americans. Okay? Those that are not directly under are under protection of the Americans. So we have a division in the broadest terms possible, because if you look at the historical records, the documentaries, the books, the research papers, there are many names given to these two blocks. Many names, but in the most broad terms possible, the simplest terms, you have the Soviet Union, which is known as the USSR, and you have the free world, which is known as the USA. So it's USSR versus USA in the broadest term. Okay? The Eastern Bloc is under the Soviets, and the Western Bloc, or the West, is under the Americans. The leaders of the free world, even to this day, by the way, sometimes you hear this term in political analysis, the leaders of the free world is still utilized. That's speaking about America, because America was the headquarter of this Western Bloc and was the chief superpower and the leading nation, effectively. And they established NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. Okay. On the eastern flank, we have the Soviet-Russian Empire or Union, and they had the Warsaw Pact. This was their equivalent here, with all the member states here, to NATO. Then we have two regions, specifically, that the Soviet Union managed to infiltrate and take over. And America was very, very concerned. The first one was on American, you could say within American reach territory, and that was the island of Cuba, the tiny nation of Cuba here, within 100 miles from the American shores, which is a very dangerous position to be in. So the Americans had to crush this very, very quickly. It was too close to home for them to maintain any level of security and peace. So Cuba was literally here at the doorsteps of America, but they were communist. Okay, they were communist. Now, in the Middle East or in Central Asia, Afghanistan was a problem. Afghanistan was a problem because the Americans realized that much of the Gulf and also the trade routes by sea, if Afghanistan was taken, all of these regions would have become compromised. And the Soviet Union could easily get into the mainland Arabian Peninsula, very easily. If they can crack Afghanistan, the rest of that region is just gone. It's Soviet. But more importantly, most importantly, in fact, the greatest oil reserves in the world were in Saudi Arabia and in Iran. All right, so if the Soviet Union could manage to not only seize these oil reserves, but also the trade routes, America and the Western world would be starved of resource and revenue. So Afghanistan was absolutely essential that it would not fall to the Soviet Union. We're going to get into that later. At the time, there was actually a coup d'etat, as we've discovered already, that became part of the daily activity for the Muslims, coup d'etat. And a communist party came into power in Afghanistan. So that was really the final straw. That was the final straw. Okay, Afghanistan could not be lost to the Soviet Union. That would be the end of it. Okay, so that's where we end up at the very end. It's very interesting. The Afghan Jihad, every Muslim should study the Afghan Jihad. Every Muslim should study it. Every Muslim should study it. Every single Muslim. So much change after that. So much change after that. And fortunately for us, we have first-hand and primary source information concerning the inside information of what happened during those days. Very, very important. It's a pivotal part of contemporary history. Every Muslim should know about Afghanistan in 1979 to 1988. Every Muslim. Every Muslim. Because what it did, it permeated through everything. Even the da'wah in the West was changed by this, and I'll show you some very interesting lectures from back in the days, okay, in America. So they divide the world into these two blocks. The Soviets managed somehow to get South American nations such as Cuba involved, and Grenada, or Grenada, depending how you want to pronounce it. And also they've managed to invade Afghanistan in '79. So America's really now all out. It has to recuperate not only Afghanistan, but also has to crush Cuba. Very exciting phase in history. In fact, many of the films, if you look at the films released in the 80s, like Rambo, right? Rambo, or for example, the computer games, Street Fighter, you find characters from Russia and America, and the Russians are always the worst, they're always the villains in these movies, right? It was a play on what was happening between the Soviet Union and the Western democracies. So it permeated the culture at the time. Everything was just electric at that time. But when you look at the world map at that time, at the height of it all, there is a vacuous field. There is an empty corridor. If you take out southern Yemen, and also if you take out the East African coast, there is an empty corridor between these two nations, between these two blocks. Okay? And this came to be known as the Third World. So the Third World at the time meant something very different to what it means today. Today the Third World means underdevelopment. These are poor, impoverished nations. Africa, Asia, South America. That's what the Third World means today. But in 48 to 88, it meant something very different. The Third World were nations that were recently independent from the British and French. And they were able to remain independent even though the Russians and the Americans were fighting one another through the Cold War. But more importantly, the Third World, these were the clients to both parties. You wanted to convert a third world nation to join your side of the battle. Okay, so the Third World at the time was actually, yes, it is. I'll tell you some stories actually about that. I'll tell you stories about that, interesting stories. So the Third World in 48 to 88 didn't mean what it means today. It meant something very different. Okay, has anyone heard of the BRICS nations, or BRICS as an organization? That's a new toy. That's a new shiny object. Every Muslim online you talk to about what's happening in Palestine, BRICS, 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 BRICS. It's a new shiny object. So at that time in 48, well actually 60, in 48 it was the Third World. And this was very lucrative because if we can get into the Third World, we expand our reach. Okay. Many nations at the time were newly independent. As I said before, they just left the British and French subjugation. They're now in a position where some of them have to think about aligning themselves to either the East or to the West for survival, but also because their own neighbors within their own regions in the Third World were threatening to invade them. So to protect themselves, they have to join one of these two major blocks. So it's quite interesting, really interesting, how things never change. I mean, you think you've fixed one problem, you end up in another problem. Nothing has changed. Nothing has changed, just a different problem on a different day. So the Third World is very lucrative, and in fact it became the focus, the area of focus for these two major blocks. However, the Third World in 1961, they created something known as the non-alignment movement. What we call today the Global South. So this already happened a long time ago. You know, as I said, nothing is new. Nothing is new. You just haven't heard about it yet. So in 61, you had 5 nation heads that came together and they signed a new treaty. It said, you guys have the NATO, you've got the Warsaw Pact. You want to fight one another? We want to stay out of it. We've had enough of these wars. So we're going to have a non-aligned movement. Yugoslavia, Egypt, India, Ghana, and Indonesia came together and they signed in Belgrade in 1961 that they want to remain neutral. We don't want to be a part of your crazy battles back and forth. We want to remain neutral. And in fact, we want to spend our time developing our economies and our nations. Does it sound familiar? Does it sound familiar? We want to come together, the global south, and we're going to develop our own nations and economies. And India took a leading position in that organization. Okay, so in '61, there's a picture of that conference. You have Tito of Yugoslavia, you have Sukarno of Indonesia, you have Nasser of Egypt, you have Nkrumah of Ghana, and you have Nehru of India. They came together. This was the BRICS before the BRICS. This was the BRICS before the BRICS. So let me show you a video of the actual undertakings on that day. Very interesting stuff. Very fascinating. Again, nothing is new here. Nothing is new. Nothing is new. So NAM was an exciting project, in fact, and quite a reasonable project, because they had just come out of World War II and World War I, and you're observing these European nations constantly riling up wars and problems. We've just got off the ground as independent states. We're not going to be dragged into another one of your crazy escapades. You know, we're going to just set aside, we're going to be non-aligned and develop our economies. So let me interfere here. So as you've heard, it's very noble, and they're trying to just rid themselves of colonialism. These guys are going around killing people, genocidal, completely just destroying nations. We have had enough of genocide. We've had enough of colonialism. We want an end to all of this. But as you mentioned here, they also want to develop economies and to counter the economic influence of the West and the East. This is exactly what BRICS is about today. Exactly the same formula. Okay. Listen to the wording and what their ambitions was in '89. '61 was when it was inaugurated. In '89 they came back together, and they're going to now tell you that at that time what their ambitions were and what they wanted for the world when it came to economic power and leverage. Alright, so another thing to keep in mind is this organization, the non-alignment movement, was also pro-Palestine. One of the reasons why they came together again in '89 was to champion the Palestinian cause. One of the reasons why, one of the levers in the machine was for the Palestinian cause. That's why you've got PLO chairman here, Yasser Arafat, present, but you'll also hear it in what they have to say. Yeah. So again, the issue of Palestine, an economic forum, an economic movement, this is nothing new. I'm not degrading or downsizing or kind of dismissing what's happening now. It's just that the idea that we haven't done this before is a misconception. We have done everything before. Alright, so there we are. So that is the BRICS all over again. Groundhog Day. We're going round the same cycle all over again. All over again. We need to be a bit more original. There is one solution that will work, but this is the only solution we don't want to look at. There's one solution that will work, that has worked, and that will always work for the Muslims in liberating Palestine. That's the only solution we're not going to rush to. Yeah. So until we decide to do what we know works, we're going to be reinventing the wheel every generation. So let's go back to the presentation. So as you can see, there was a movement in the third world region. So the third world at that time had leverage, and they came together to actually become an independent bloc, a southern bloc that would work with the northern bloc where necessary to develop the economies of these nations, but also to champion the liberation or the case in Palestine. Okay? So this was, again, BRICS 1.0. We haven't seen the objectives met yet. There were many reasons for it. Many of these nations became later on embroiled in their own problems, in their own wars and crises, but the intention was certainly there. And by the way, the non-alignment movement still exists. It still exists. I think Uganda now is currently leading the organization, but it still exists. It's still out there. So in general terms, then, the world is divided into two blocks: Eastern Bloc and a Western Bloc. The Eastern Bloc and the Western Bloc. You know, it reminds me a lot of something that used to happen in the 90s, a major division in America, West Side and East Side, East Coast, West Coast. Okay, if you were with the East Coast rappers, you were against the West Coast rappers, And as a result of this futile and meaningless conflict, many lives were taken. Many people were killed, right, prematurely. At a global scale, that was exactly what the Cold War was about, at a global scale. The Eastern Bloc versus the Western Bloc, okay? And if you sided with the Eastern Bloc, you had to be an enemy to the Western Bloc and vice versa, unfortunately. So, in order to recruit members from this neutral zone, which is known as a third world, both blocs began to do something to entice. They began to entice these nations. There we are, exactly. They began to entice these nations to join them, okay? I personally have an acronym for it, and it's known as white power. They began to give white power to their allies. So anyone who wanted to ally themselves with Washington or the West, the headquarters of the Western Bloc, or Moscow, the headquarters of the Eastern Bloc, would be rewarded, incentivized with white power. Yeah? White power represents the first thing that you would be in receipt of is weapons. This is why Iraq, for example, many of the Arab nations, Iraq and Egypt and Syria, when they went to war against Israel, were able to rely upon Russian arms, tanks, planes, guns. The weapons came when you became an ally to the Soviets, right? Likewise, the Americans also sent jets and weaponry to their allies. So the first benefit of joining one of these two camps was you receive weapons. The most important, you receive weapons. Now, these weapons were not used to fight necessarily Russia or America, but in most cases to fight your neighbors immediately around you, your immediate neighbors. So if your neighbor went with the Russians and received the Russian tanks, you would have to be exceptionally naive to remain neutral. You have to now settle the score by joining the other side. Either you join Moscow or you join America. You had to find another way to counterbalance the threat of a neighboring state arming itself. And the best example for this was the Iraq-Iran war. The best example for this was the Iraq-Iran war from 1980 to 1988. We're going to cover it next month, inshallah. So that was a great example of you need to be receiving support, weapons from one of these two major superpowers. Otherwise, you will lose the battle in your own territory. So even if a nation didn't want to be allied to America or to Moscow, by necessity, at some point, it has to find a protector. And this is why when the Ottomans were around, we didn't have that problem. But now that we live independently, and we don't have a central nerve center or some sort of protection shield, we have to ally ourselves to the wildest and mightiest cowboy in town, whether the one in the east or the one in the west. So the first reward they give to nations from the third world who side with them is weapons. The second is they give them help, assistance. So this comes in the form of money. This comes in a source of protection. This comes in a source of advice. So once the weapons come in, you also receive help. If you are ever to be invaded, which is why, for example, when Kuwait was invaded by Saddam, who came to support Kuwait? Who came to support Kuwait? When Saddam went in there and took it, and also threatened to go to Saudi Arabia and take that as well. Who came to support Kuwait and Saudi? It was, the Americans. And that will be, again, the central focal point of next month, the final episode, because a huge problem begins. You're inviting the Americans into the Arabian Peninsula, a huge problem begins there. But they had to have them there. So you receive help militarily and protection from the Americans or from the Russians. So that's another incentive to join one of the two camps. I want you to imagine if Kuwait or Saudi Arabia did not have America as a support and as a protection. Iraq had weapons from the Americans and also from the USSR. So it would be a walk in the park. By necessity, for those who complain or for those who accuse the Gulf nations of having to get support from kuffar, Saddam would have just eaten them up. Literally, would have just swallowed them up. They had to have support. Within themselves, they were not united anyway. Because in North Yemen, Saudi and North Yemen, who had never got on anyway, they never got along. And the nations around them, around that, Iran wasn't friendly with the Arab Gulf, so there were enemies everywhere around them. They had to have a greater superpower to support them, and that was America. They chose America for many reasons. So that help was absolutely essential, especially if you were an oil-producing nation, because everybody wanted a piece of that oil. You know, you had Kuwait stealing oil from Iraq. You had Iraq who wanted to get Khuzestan in Iran, which was the Arab province in Iran, which had a lot of oil. So each nation in the oil-producing regions was fighting to seize the other person's oil field, or to cut their quota of the OPEC production, or to undermine their democracy, or to sabotage their government. Khomeini in 79 began to sabotage, and he declared it openly. All these Arab nations, he will export his revolution to their nations. And he began with Iraq, right next door, with the Kurds, inciting them to go against Saddam. Right? So it was a problem. And if you remain neutral, you would be basically prey for the wolves. So they all picked their side very quickly. So help was very, very important. The third thing that you'll be receiving when you pick a side is, so you receive the weaponry, the support, the military. So for example, in 79, when the Kaaba was besieged by 𝗾𝙗𝗓 and his men, the French came, the French military special forces came to save the day. Right? So that help comes when you pick a side. Then intelligence. So if you side with America, the CIA will help you. You know, for example, when the Shah of Iran established his American connection, they helped him establish SAVAK, which was the Iranian intelligence service. The CIA supported him in that sense to establish his own security system. Likewise, when you go with the Russians or the Soviets, they will help you from the KGB. The KGB was the CIA equivalent to Russia. So they would also support you. So for example, some of the socialist, communist Arab nations, the KGB would help them with intelligence. Nasser, when he was with the Soviets, was receiving KGB invites and intel. So again, if your neighbor is already siding with one of these nations, let's say he's siding with the USSR, he's receiving weapons. So if you go into war, he's superior in terms of arms, which was the case in Iraq and in Iran. He's receiving help. So even if you manage to overpower him or overpower them, their ally will come in and take over, and they're receiving intelligence. So they're always a step ahead when it comes to the next move. It's inevitable. You have to pick a side. It becomes inevitable. You have to pick a side, especially if you have something to lose, such as oil and territory. So weapons, help, intelligence. Then they receive technology. So for those who are developing their own infrastructure, they wanted to have their own oil exploitation and exploration networks and systems. The Americans can help you with that, so can the Russians. They can build roads and airports and military bases. So technology comes with the package. And as we know, most of the nations at that time were not militarily or technologically advanced. They were still just surviving. So having the Russians come in and the Chinese come in and develop your military equipment and your infrastructure was a great incentive. Likewise, for the Americans to have their technology to come and support you and invest in your country, such was the case in Iran under the Shah, was a great incentive. Right? So in as much as there was a non-aligned movement, so long as one or two of those nations, for example, Egypt, took sides, and at one point was with the Americans, then went with the Russians, then went back to the Americans. If Egypt is picking sides, why should the others remain neutral? Why should they remain neutral and remain susceptible to the threat of being taken over by Egypt? So as soon as one takes in the region, the others have to take. Yeah, that's just a reality of the matter. Now, ideally, we remain neutral. Nobody sides with these or those, this or that block. But the reality is, when you are in a neighborhood, everybody is looking out for their own interests, and in fact, they're looking to take your house over. You need protection. You need protection. Yeah? So that's how things began to develop in the third world region.
Aligned, because there was a movement of non-aligned who decided not to side with, even though it didn't gain that much power, but some states and countries decided to not align either with the US or Soviet Union back in the days.
These are the peripheral nations that have nothing to lose and nothing to offer. Yeah, we're talking about the key nations with oil. In that middle region, they have oil, especially oil. That's the main port, and they have neighbors around them who are hostile, who already have sided with one side. Okay, those people have no choice. They have no choice. They have to pick a side. Right, so they've picked sides. Some have flipped and flopped left and right, such as Egypt. Others picked a side and remain in that side till this very day. Saudi Arabia, for example, Kuwait, Qatar, the Gulf nations. Yeah. Others had a side, but when the Soviet machine died, they lost their side. So now they're kind of in limbo. Right, but you had to pick a side. And then eventually, and if you remember the lecture from the actual non-aligned movement, he said very clearly, we don't have economic power, we don't have military power, we have moral power. I'm sorry, but when a war breaks out, moral power is not going to support you, it's not going to help you. You need military and economic power. Morality in times of war is not any consolation at all. So it's nice to have the ideal that we're not going to take any sides, but when war breaks out, you have a Saddam next door, you're going to rush to the Americans. You're going to rush to the Americans. Yeah. It's just the reality of war. And finally, endorsement. So that meant if you were an aspiring group within, let's say, country A, you have sided with the Americans and you want to topple your government, which is a communist government or a neutral government, America will give you the arms, the support, the intelligence for how to do it, the technology, and when you manage to overthrow a government, the endorsement. They will recognize you as a nation. So that's a full package. You receive the full package. And likewise, the Soviets, if you topple your own government, which is pro-West, they'll give you the armaments, the financing, the intelligence, the assurance that if something goes wrong, we can support and help you. And finally, when you succeed, they can give you endorsement to recognize you internationally as, yes, a legitimate country, even if how you got there was illegitimate. So that white power privilege made it very difficult for the neutral zones to remain so. Yeah? It made it very difficult to remain neutral.
Welcome to 𝗲𝗓𝗓𝗏, the world's leading online learning platform specializing in Islamic history. Discover the 𝗲𝗓𝗓𝗏 mobile app and participate in regular live and interactive seminars and tune in directly from your handset from anywhere in the world. Enjoy instant access to a growing catalog of on-demand streaming content exclusive to the platform, accessible from a variety of devices including desktops, tablets, and cell phones. Connect instantly with our global community of history enthusiasts via our private community forum. To find out more about our online history programs and resources, visit our website today at www.𝗲𝗓𝗓𝗏𝗡.com.